January 1946. Berlin. The snow fell in silence over the ruins of the Reichstag. It was not the triumphant snow of Christmas cards or Bavarian postcards. It was the snow that settles on graves, on shattered stone, on the skeletal remains of what had once been called the Thousand-Year Reich. The wind carried with it the smell of burnt timber and damp plaster, the ghost scent of a city that had been reduced to rubble by its own ambitions. In the cellars and makeshift shelters scattered across the Soviet and American sectors, German mothers held their children closer, not from the cold alone, but from a hunger that had become as familiar as breathing. The war had ended 8 months prior, but for those who survived it, the war had merely changed its uniform. Now it wore the face of winter, of empty stomachs, of children who no longer cried because crying required energy they did not possess. In one such cellar, beneath what had once been an apartment building on Kantstrasse, a woman named Margarete Schröder sat with her 2 daughters. The eldest was 7. The youngest was 3. Their father had not returned from the Eastern Front. Their grandmother had died during the firebombing raids of early 1945. Margaret had not eaten in 2 days, saving what little she could scavenge for the girls. Her hands were raw from scrubbing laundry in frozen water, trading cleanliness for bread crust from the Allied soldiers who now occupied her city. She did not think of politics anymore. She did not think of flags or anthems. She thought only of survival, of the next meal, of whether her daughters would live to see spring. This was the Germany that greeted the American occupation forces in the winter of 1945 and 1946. Not the Germany of propaganda reels or military parades, but the Germany of consequences, of mothers and children living in the wreckage of ideology that had promised them glory and delivered only ashes. The soldiers of the United States Army who arrived in the months following Germany's unconditional surrender had been trained to hate the enemy. They had seen the photographs from Dachau, from Buchenwald, from Bergen-Belsen. They had liberated the camps and witnessed horrors that no training manual could have prepared them for. They had fought through hedgerows in Normandy, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, through the fortified towns along the Siegfried Line. They had lost brothers and friends to German bullets, German shells, German fanaticism. And yet, when they entered the cities of the defeated Reich, many of them found themselves confronted with something their anger had not anticipated: the faces of children. The hollow eyes of women who looked less like the villains of wartime newsreels and more like their own mothers and sisters, transplanted into a nightmare. The official policy of the Allied occupation was strict. Fraternization with German civilians was forbidden. The directive known as JCS 1067, issued in April 1945, explicitly prohibited American soldiers from showing sympathy or offering assistance beyond the minimum required to prevent disease and unrest. Germany was to be treated as a defeated enemy, not as a charity case. The architects of this policy believed that the German people needed to confront the full weight of their collective guilt, to understand that their support, whether active or passive, for the Nazi regime had led directly to the destruction now surrounding them. There would be no Marshall Plan yet, no generosity, only occupation, only discipline. But orders written in Washington do not account for the human heart. By the winter of 1946, American soldiers stationed across the western zones of Germany began to violate regulations on a scale that their superiors found difficult to suppress. They saw the children first, children who stood outside the mess halls, silent and watchful, waiting for scraps. Children whose legs were thin as kindling, whose skin stretched tight over bone. Children who did not beg because they had learned that begging often brought nothing but shame. The soldiers saw them and thought of their own younger siblings, their own nieces and nephews back in Iowa or Texas or New York. And they began to share their rations. At first, it was small. A chocolate bar slipped to a boy who reminded a private from Ohio of his kid brother. A half-eaten sandwich handed to a girl with blonde braids who stood too quietly by the roadside. But as the winter deepened and the desperation became impossible to ignore, the acts of kindness grew larger and more organized. Soldiers began pooling their own supplies. They requisitioned surplus blankets from quartermaster depots, claiming they were needed for barracks repairs. They diverted powdered milk from military kitchens. They collected toys sent from home, originally intended for themselves or for trade, and instead gave them to German children who had not held a toy in years. The first recorded large-scale distribution occurred in Frankfurt in late January 1946. A chaplain attached to the Third Army, Captain Robert MacDonald, organized what he called a humanitarian supply drive among the men of his regiment. He did not ask for permission from headquarters. He simply began collecting donations and announced that on a Sunday afternoon, they would distribute goods to families living in the most devastated sections of the city. The response from the soldiers was overwhelming. Within a week, Captain MacDonald had gathered over 300 wool blankets, 50 cans of powdered milk, 200 bars of soap, and a sack full of second-hand toys, wooden soldiers, rag dolls, tin cars, that had been mailed from the States. On the day of the distribution, Margarete Schröder heard about it from a neighbor. She did not believe it at first. Charity from the occupiers seemed like a cruel rumor, the kind of false hope that had circulated during the war whenever someone whispered that the Führer had a secret plan to turn the tide. But her daughters were hungry, and disbelief was a luxury she could not afford. She wrapped them in whatever scraps of cloth still held warmth and walked 3 kilometers through the snow to the church where the Americans were said to be waiting. When she arrived, there were already 200 women and children in line. They stood in silence, their breath rising in pale clouds. No one spoke. No one dared to hope too loudly. And then the doors opened, and American soldiers began calling them forward, one family at a time. Margaret stepped inside with her daughters clinging to her skates. A young soldier, no older than 20, with red hair and freckles, smiled at her. She did not understand the English words he spoke, but his tone was gentle. He handed her a heavy wool blanket, military issue, still smelling faintly of mothballs and canvas. Then another soldier, an older man with sergeant stripes, placed 2 cans of powdered milk into her arms. The weight of them was extraordinary. She had not held something so solid, so full of promise, in months. And then, as if the universe had decided to perform a small miracle, a third soldier knelt down and offered her youngest daughter a cloth doll with button eyes and yellow yarn hair. Margarete Schröder, who had not cried when her husband's last letter arrived in the autumn of 1944, who had not cried when the bombs fell, who had not cried when she buried her mother in a shallow grave because the ground was too frozen for proper digging. Margarete Schröder stood in that church and wept. She wept not only from relief, though relief was part of it. She wept because the kindness was unbearable, because the men who had every reason to hate her, to despise her and her nation, had instead chosen to see her daughters as children, not as German children, not as the offspring of the enemy, just as children. She was not alone. Across the room, other mothers cried as they received blankets, as they clutched cans of milk, as they watched their sons and daughters hold toys for the first time in years. Some cried silently, tears streaking down gaunt faces. Others sobbed openly, their shoulders shaking. The soldiers, many of whom had prepared themselves for gratitude, found instead that they did not know how to respond to this depth of emotion. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stood quietly, bearing witness. A few cried as well. The scene repeated itself across Germany throughout that bitter winter. In Munich, in Cologne, in the shattered towns of the Ruhr Valley, American soldiers defied orders and distributed whatever they could spare. The official military government continued to insist on non-fraternization, but the policy was crumbling from the inside. Generals issued stern reminders. Commanders threatened disciplinary action. But courts-martial for sharing a blanket with a freezing child proved politically impossible, and the directive was quietly, informally, abandoned. The German mothers who received these gifts found themselves confronting a paradox that shattered the ideological foundation upon which they had been raised. For over a decade, the Nazi regime had taught them that Americans would degenerate, that democracy was weak, that the United States was a mongrel nation without culture or strength, driven only by greed and Jewish manipulation. The propaganda had been relentless. Posters depicted American soldiers as gangsters and brutes. Radio broadcasts described a country in moral decay, where racial mixing and capitalism had produced a hollow civilization incapable of sacrifice or nobility. The German people had been told that they were superior, that their suffering under the Weimar Republic had been the fault of external enemies, and that the new order would restore their rightful place in history. And yet, here were those same Americans, the supposed barbarians, handing out blankets to the children of their enemies. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Margarete Schröder had believed, or at least had tried to believe, in the vision her government had sold her. She had voted for the Nazi Party in 1933, not out of fanaticism but out of desperation, hoping for stability in jobs and an end to the chaos that had consumed Germany after the Great War. She had cheered when the economy improved. She had looked away when Jewish neighbors disappeared. She had told herself that the Führer knew what he was doing, that sacrifices were necessary, that victory was inevitable. Even when the bombs began to fall, even when the ration cards became worthless, she had clung to the belief that Germany's cause was just, that the enemy was monstrous, that the suffering would be worth it in the end. But the blanket in her arms was real. The milk was real. The doll her daughter held was real. And the young American soldier who had smiled at her had not looked like a monster. He had looked like a boy who missed his home. This moment, this small, quiet transaction in a bombed-out church, was repeated thousands of times across occupied Germany, and each time it carried the weight of revelation. The German people had been told one story about the world, and now the world itself was offering testimony to the contrary. The Americans were not cruel. They were not savages. They had won the war not through brutality alone, but through industrial strength, through resources so abundant that they could afford to give away blankets and milk even to the defeated. And more unsettling still, they seemed to operate according to a moral framework that recognized humanity even in their enemies. The blanket became a symbol, not in the grand propagandistic sense, but in the intimate, personal way that objects carry meaning for those who hold them. For Margarete and thousands like her, the blanket was proof that the world was not what she had been told. It was proof that abundance existed, that generosity was possible, that perhaps the ideology she had supported was not built on truth but on lies designed to justify cruelty. The blanket was heavy and warm, and it kept her daughters from freezing, but it was also a weight of a different kind. It was the weight of complicity, of recognition, of shame. Historical records from the period document this psychological transformation. In letters intercepted by Allied censors, German civilians wrote to relatives in the Soviet zone describing the Americans as unexpectedly kind, as nicht so schlimm wie gesagt, not as bad as they were told. In interviews conducted by military government officials, women expressed confusion and gratitude in equal measure. One woman in Stuttgart, questioned about her feelings toward the occupiers, said simply, "They feed our children. How can I hate them?" Another, in Hamburg, admitted that she had begun to doubt everything she had learned under the Third Reich because the enemy showed more mercy than our own leaders ever did. The soldiers themselves were changed by these encounters. Many had arrived in Germany with righteous anger, determined to see the German people suffer as their victims had suffered. But anger is difficult to sustain in the face of starving children. Letters home from American GIs in early 1946 reflect a shift in tone. A private from Kansas wrote to his mother, "I thought I would hate them all, but when you see the kids, you can't help it. They didn't start this war. They are just hungry." A corporal from Pennsylvania wrote, "We won, but it doesn't feel like I thought it would. It just feels sad." A lieutenant from California, writing in his personal diary, confessed, "Gave my rations to a little girl today. She smiled, and I realized I hadn't seen a German kid smile since we got here. Made me think about what we're doing. Made me think about what winning really means." The distribution of aid was not universally supported. Some soldiers resented what they saw as coddling the enemy. Some officers worried that kindness would be mistaken for weakness. And there were German civilians who remained ideologically committed to National Socialism, who accepted the blankets and milk without gratitude, who saw the American generosity as a cynical ploy or as proof of their own racial superiority even in defeat. But these voices were increasingly drowned out by the material reality of survival and the undeniable contrast between what they had been promised and what they had received. By the spring of 1946, unofficial aid efforts had become so widespread that the military government was forced to acknowledge them. The policy of non-fraternization was officially relaxed in June 1945, And by early 1946, programs like the Government Aid and Relief in Occupied Areas, or GERIOA, began funneling official resources into feeding programs and medical aid. The soldiers' spontaneous acts of charity had created political pressure that policy could no longer resist. The blankets and milk that had started as violations of orders became the foundation of a broader humanitarian strategy. But the true impact was not measured in tons of food or numbers of blankets distributed. It was measured in the transformation of minds. The German people, particularly the women who had lived through the collapse, began to reassess not only their views of Americans but their understanding of power, governance, and ideology itself. The Nazi regime had taught them that strength was synonymous with cruelty, that compassion was weakness, that the world was a Darwinian struggle in which only the ruthless survived. The Americans, with their abundant supplies and casual generosity, offered a different model. They demonstrated that strength could coexist with mercy, that abundance could be shared, that a society built on democratic principles could produce not only military victory, but also moral authority. This lesson was absorbed slowly, unevenly. Germany would spend decades grappling with its past, with a question of how an educated, cultured nation had descended into barbarism. But the seeds of that reckoning were planted in moments like the one Margarete experienced in that Frankfurt church. The blanket she received was not forgiveness. It was not absolution, but it was an invitation to think differently, to imagine a world in which power did not require annihilation, in which victory did not demand vengeance. The American soldiers who handed out those blankets did not see themselves as philosophers or moral teachers. Most of them were barely out of their teens, farm boys and factory workers who had been drafted into a war they had not chosen. They acted not out of grand strategy but out of simple human decency. They saw hunger and they shared their food. They saw cold and they gave their blankets. In doing so, they embodied the principles their nation claimed to represent. Principles that had often been honored more in the breach than the observance, but which, in that frozen winter of 1946, became tangible and real. The contrast between American abundance and German deprivation was stark and intentional, though not in the way Nazi propagandists had framed it. The United States had entered the war late, and its homeland had never been bombed. Its factories had hummed with production, turning out tanks and planes and ships at a rate that defied comprehension. Its soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and supplied by a logistical network that stretched across oceans. German soldiers, by contrast, had spent the final years of the war scavenging for fuel, for ammunition, for food. They had fought with dwindling resources against an enemy that seemed to have infinite reserves. And now, in defeat, the German people were confronted with the full scope of that disparity. The milk powder that American soldiers distributed so casually was a luxury beyond imagining. The wool blankets, standard military issue, represented a level of material wealth that Germany, even at the height of its pre-war recovery, had never achieved for its common citizens. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a democratic capitalist system that, for all its flaws, had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a scale totalitarian regimes could not match. The Nazi economy had been built on plunder, on the exploitation of conquered territories and slave labor. It had been efficient in the short term, but unsustainable. The American economy, by contrast, had demonstrated resilience and adaptability. It had produced not only weapons but also food, medicine, and consumer goods in quantity sufficient to supply both its own population and its allies. The blankets handed to German mothers were symbols of this systemic difference, proof that the democratic model, dismissed by fascists as weak and decadent, had outperformed its authoritarian rival in every measurable way. Margarete Schröder kept that blanket for the rest of her life. It became a fixture in her home, first in the cellar, then in the small apartment she was eventually assigned in the rebuilt sections of Berlin. Her daughters grew up wrapped in it during cold nights. They played on it during the day. When they asked where it came from, she told them the story, not all at once, but in pieces over years. She told them about the church, about the soldier with red hair, about the doll with button eyes. She told them about the crying, about the shame and the gratitude, about the realization that everything she had believed was wrong. In 1961, when the wall went up and Berlin was divided, Margaret found herself on the western side. She watched as the Soviet sector hardened into a prison state, as families were separated, as the promises of socialism curdled into surveillance and repression. She thought often about the blanket, about the choice between systems, about what Macy looked like in practice rather than in propaganda. When her granddaughter was born in 1968, Margaret gave her the blanket, now threadbare and patched, and told her the story once more. The granddaughter, growing up in the Federal Republic, found it hard to imagine a time when a blanket could mean the difference between life and death, when kindness from a stranger could shatter an entire worldview. But she kept the blanket anyway, because her grandmother asked her to, because it was a relic of a history that must not be forgotten. The story of the blankets and the milk and the toys is not widely remembered today. It does not appear in the grand narratives of the Second World War, does not occupy a chapter in the history books that recount battles and treaties and political decisions. But it is part of the war's legacy nonetheless, a quiet testament to the power of small acts in the face of large ideologies. The German mothers who cried in 1946 were not crying only for themselves. They were crying for the lost years, for the children who had died, for the lies they had believed, for the world that might have been if different choices had been made. The American soldiers who gave away their blankets returned home and rarely spoke of it. For them, it was a minor episode, overshadowed by the combat they had survived and the friends they had lost. They did not think of themselves as heroes for sharing a blanket. They did not expect recognition or thanks. But in the act of giving, they had done something that no amount of military victory could accomplish alone. They had shown that the war was not only about defeating an enemy but about affirming a set of values. Values that insisted on the dignity of human life, on the possibility of redemption, on the responsibility of the strong to care for the weak. This is the paradox at the heart of the occupation, that the victors, who had every right to vengeance, chose instead a path that allowed for rebuilding. That the soldiers, who had every reason to hate, chose instead to see the humanity in their former enemies. That the mothers, who had supported a regime of unspeakable cruelty, were given the chance to begin again, not because they deserved it, but because children deserve to eat and to be warm and to hold toys. The blanket was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Years later, historians would debate the effectiveness of the American occupation, the wisdom of the Marshall Plan, the speed of West Germany's integration into the democratic West. They would analyze economic data and political treaties and cultural exchanges. But beneath all that analysis, beneath the statistics and the policy papers, was a simpler truth, that in the winter of 1946, when everything seemed lost, when the world was divided between victors and vanquished, between the guilty and the innocent, a series of small acts of kindness had planted seeds that would grow into something larger. Not redemption, perhaps, but recognition. Not absolution, but the possibility of change. The children who received those toys grew up in a different Germany. They became citizens of the Federal Republic, a nation rebuilt on democratic principles, a nation that confronted its past with a rigor and honesty that remains remarkable. They were raised by mothers who had learned, through bitter experience, that ideology unmoored from morality leads only to ruin. And some of them, in time, told the stories they had been told, passing down the memory of a time when an enemy had chosen kindness, when a blanket had been more than a blanket, when the world had revealed itself to be more complex and more merciful than propaganda had ever allowed. This is what history forgets, that the great tides of events are made up of individual moments, of choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The soldiers who handed out blankets were not trying to change the world. They were trying to help a child. But in doing so, they participated in a transformation as profound as any battle, as lasting as any treaty. They demonstrated that victory without humanity is hollow, that power without compassion is tyranny, that the true measure of a civilization is found not in its strength but in its mercy. Margarete Schröder died in 1987, just 2 years before the wall fell. She did not live to see the reunification of Germany, did not witness the final collapse of the Soviet system that had imprisoned half her country for 4 decades. But she had seen enough to understand the lesson the blanket had taught her, that freedom and abundance are not weaknesses, that democracy, for all its messiness and imperfection, creates societies capable of generosity, that the American soldiers who had occupied her city had offered something more valuable than food and cloth. They had offered a vision of what the world could be if it chose differently. The blanket, worn thin by time and use, remains in the family still. It sits folded in a drawer in a house in Berlin, a tangible link to a moment when history turned on acts of kindness, when mothers cried not from despair but from the unbearable weight of unexpected mercy, when the victors proved that winning the war was not enough. They had to win the peace as well. One blanket, one can of milk, one small toy at a time. And in that choice, in those tears, in the silence of a Frankfurt church on a winter afternoon in 1946, lay the seeds of a different future, a future built not on vengeance but on the possibility of redemption, on the understanding that even in the aftermath of the greatest evil, humanity can find its way back to itself, one small act of kindness at a time.